I'm going to tell a quick story. Old people tell stories, sometimes to the people that know them many times. I had a student, 10-year-old African-American boy, Marshall School District, who was the poster boy for ADHD. And he had numerous behavioral issues, was restrained over and over and over again, numerous times. Mom was a very, very strong advocate. Mom was a very, very strong advocate, and they didn't like her. And they figured out that when he became 10 years old, we're going to talk about juvenile law here in a second, they could bring charges against him, right? Make him go to juvenile court. We brought a due process against the school. We ended up suing them in federal court. We settled that case. And two segues here are very, very important. He left that school district where he was being restrained every day, multiple times a day, and taking multiple pharmaceutical drugs. And he moved to another school district. And the next year, guess how many times he was restrained? Once, right? Different school district, different environment, different teachers, different surroundings. And then separate and apart from that, sadly, he was in the juvenile justice system. And he was 10 years old. He was in detention for 3 days, 3 nights. And when he went to juvenile court in that county, they shackled the children, and they also had them handcuffed when they traveled to court. And when they were before the judge, they remained shackled. And we brought a lawsuit on that, and we lost for various reasons. But I'm happy to say the Texas Supreme Court changed the rules for juveniles in Texas that you can't shackle them in court anymore. So our lawsuit did that. But one of the reasons I'm telling this story is because what we've heard before is intended to prevent that day in court for these kids. But unfortunately, we can't all do that. So we're going to ask Natalie to come up here, and Matt talk a little bit within the half hour we've got. Natalie, come introduce yourself a little bit. Now, I'm very, very lucky. I used to be an adjunct faculty at UT Austin Social Work School, and I have 2 graduates.
We're in the same spot.
Okay. So anyway, so Natalie, introduce yourself a little bit, say what you're doing nowadays, and Matt as well, and we'll do the best we can together in a half hour.
Okay. I'm Dr. Natalie Beck Aguilara. I am a licensed clinical social worker and supervisor. For the first 10 years of my career, I worked direct practice in schools, alternative schools, the juvenile system, and the adult system. So I essentially followed the school to prison pipeline as a professional. And then for the last 6 years, I've taught social work at St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas. And now I study and teach about the school to prison pipeline. So very briefly, y'all probably already know this, but a brief overview of exclusionary discipline. So we have in-school suspension and out-of-school suspension, but they're still at the campus, right? And then if they're expelled, then they're off the campus. They can be sent to a DAEP or a JJAEP, District Alternative Education Program, or a Juvenile Justice Alternative Education Program. The bigger districts will have the JJAPs, right? And so this is an alternative school campus, sometimes they're together. And then the juvenile system, they'll also be educated within the juvenile system, right? So there's education at each level. It looks different. I will say that when they're sent to the adult system at 17, the state of Texas is breaking their compulsory attendance laws because they're not sent to school, but that's another soapbox. Students with disabilities, as you know, are overrepresented throughout exclusionary discipline. For example, a study a few years ago said in DAEPs in Texas, it's about 10% students of special ed, right? 27% of DAEP were students in special ed. What I saw in my practice is even more students that had not been identified, right? I can't tell you how many kiddos I worked with in juvenile detention that couldn't read. And I'm like, how are you in high school and you can't read, right? Each level should comply with all applicable laws, right? There's education at each level. They're not excluded from the laws that constrain education at each level, right? The JJAP in Travis County, where I live and work, they say they will not accept a student if they cannot comply with their IEP. They shouldn't, right? But who's watching out for that? Who's there to make sure that that's happening, right? Alternative education programs are often have smaller classes, which can be a very good thing. In fact, I'm sure y'all have had clients that are like, I like it better there. They're smaller classes, right? The most heartbreaking thing a student said to me is they're not scared of me there. They're scared of me at my homeschool, but they're used to working with kids like me. Yeah, so that's why he liked it better there. But they're also often multi-level classes, right? School levels, and then all kinds of inclusion, which could be a good thing, right? But also on the flip side, not a lot of support, not a lot of individualized attention. The disciplinary schools I've worked with, they usually say all our teachers are special ed certified. And I'm like, cool, but does that mean they're getting the supports, right? Involvement with the system can include access to resources, right? Unfortunately, there's a ton of money in our juvenile legal system, and they provide a ton of resources that kiddos don't often have access to, not being a part of the system, right? So it's kind of a catch-22. And I've heard people say things like, well, now they're in the system, at least they'll get the help they need. No. If you can keep them out of the system, keep them out of the system at all costs, right? But sometimes they're there anyway, so we can at least ask what supports the system can provide. What resources do we have access to now that we didn't have access to before they were in the system? This could look like things like counseling, case management. Y'all, when I worked for juvenile probation in Travis County, we had the best case management that nobody knew about. I could refer anybody to case management for anything. Oh, mom needs a job, kid needs transportation. Like, you would not believe, and anybody on probation could get it, but it was the best kept secret because anybody could get it, right? Groups, psychologists, all this testing we're talking about, right? Very expensive testing. There are psychologists on staff, psychiatrists. So many times kiddos don't have access to psychiatrists until they're on probation, which is sad, right? I highly recommend, if possible, looking for providers outside of the system. So even if the system is paying, can we take this community agency provider that's doing the program versus the system providing it? Because unfortunately, what I saw a lot of times is kids get in the system, they get lots of support, they're doing better, they get cut off probation, guess what? They lose all their services, right? So if possible, if you have a choice, ask them for everything that they offer, right? Choose providers outside the system. So that is my thoughts in a nutshell. I'd be happy to talk afterwards. Here's Matt.